In 2010, Square Enix released Final Fantasy XIII for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, 4 years after the game's debuted at E3 2006. Final Fantasy XIII was highly anticipated, and gamers were hungry for the latest installment in one of the most beloved role-playing game series of all time. Unfortunately, Final Fantasy XIII, while a critical and financial success, polarized gamers and failed to live up to the expectations of the legendary franchise. So what went wrong, and why did Final Fantasy XIII disappoint gamers? Well, let's start with what Final Fantasy XIII got right, namely the graphics. The graphics in Final Fantasy XIII are simply gorgeous. Not only did they push the technical limitations of the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, but the world of Cocoon and Pulse are both vibrant and stunning to look at. With that out of the way, let's look at exactly what went wrong with Final Fantasy XIII. The primary drawback of Final Fantasy XIII lies in its battle system. In an attempt to streamline the traditional Japanese role-playing game battle system, the developers took far too much control away from the player. In battle, you can only control one party member at a time, and their actions are automatically chosen for you, unless you manually input your own command. If a character's health is low, they'll automatically use a potion. If an enemy is weak to a certain element, they'll spam that spell. If the enemy uses strong physical attacks, they'll cast Protect, so on and so forth. Although there's some depth to strategy to Final Fantasy XIII, in that you can switch the roles of your characters, for example from a tank to a magic DPS mid-combat, gameplay ultimately made gamers feel uninvolved. The level up Crystorium system didn't help to remedy the restrictive battle system. In Final Fantasy XIII, you accumulate crystal points, which you are able to use to level up your characters. Although you are able to choose which roles you want to level up for your characters, the progression of these level ups are extremely linear. Aside from a few branching paths that only serve to increase the stats of your characters, you are almost always limited to progressing in a single path, leaving few options for players to customize their characters. Speaking of linear, let's talk about the level design. You see these mostly straight lines? These are actual maps of Final Fantasy XIII. For the most part in Final Fantasy XIII, you'll be walking in a straight line from point A to point B, occasionally following a side path that will lead you to a treasure chest. There are no towns, and aside from Pulse, an open field with a few side quests you encounter 3/4 the way through the game, you'll spend the entire duration of Final Fantasy XIII walking in a relatively straight line in one area, fighting a boss, then moving on to another area, rinse and repeat. Final Fantasy XIII has been mocked by fans for this, earning the very appropriate moniker Final Hallways 13. This abundance of linearity could possibly be forgiven if Final Fantasy XIII had a rich, deep narrative. After all, the Final Fantasy series is known for some of the best storytelling in games. From the death of Ares in Final Fantasy VII to the rise of the Mad Jester Kefka and the Godhood in Final Fantasy VI, the narrative of the series has always been engaging. So does Final Fantasy XIII at least tell a compelling story? Bluntly put, no. The game's story continually assaults players with terminology invented for the game, such as Lissi, Falsi, Focus, etc., and gives you no explanation to what these terms actually mean.
Okay, if we don't know our focus, how do we complete it?
Oh, you can find out what they mean if you look them up in the in-game encyclopedia. But honestly, who wants to read an encyclopedia when they're playing a game? Players shouldn't be forced to look up these definitions in menus. They should be given to them in a few simple lines of exposition. The result of this confuses players and leaves them feeling uninvolved with the story. The characters in Final Fantasy XIII, apart from their unique designs, are fairly uninteresting as well. Aside from Saz and Hope, none of the other party members are given moments to develop their characters. So by the time the final boss rolls along, you've long since stopped caring. Final Fantasy XIII may have been disappointing to fans and critics alike. But regardless, the game sold well enough to warrant not one, but 2 direct sequels. Final Fantasy XIII 2 came out in 2012, which is noted to have improved the battle system and features the return of towns. A third game, Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII, came out in 2014. Final Fantasy XV, formerly known as Versus Final Fantasy XIII, is slated to arrive on the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, hopefully within our lifetime. We can only hope that Square Enix will learn from the mistakes of Final Fantasy XIII with the 15th installment.
Really? Now that is kinda sad.